So you saw in the bottled water ads that there was not much information provided. These ads are mainly intended to be persuasive. And we saw in the Penn and Teller episode that many consumers are actually convinced that bottled water is better than tap water. However, in that episode we also saw that with the blind tasting, most consumers preferred the tap water. And that raises a question. The advertising has made some consumers value bottled water more than they did before. But are these consumers actually getting more of a benefit, more pleasure from bottled water than they were before? Is there too much advertising of bottled water? So here we're going to be looking at persuasive advertising and looking at its effects on welfare and whether there is too much advertising or too little. In the 1978 paper called Advertising Welfare, Dixit and Norman looked at persuasive advertising and found that in imperfectly competitive industries, firms advertise too much in equilibrium. So here, too much means that the firms advertise more than the amount that would maximize welfare, given the equilibrium output choices of the firms. This result is not obvious because under imperfect competition, firms usually produce too little. If advertising causes consumers to buy more, then that will increase welfare because it moves the quantity towards the point where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. So to understand this result of Dixit and Norman, we're going to consider the monopoly case. So this turns out to be relatively simple and we can analyze it in one diagram. So to analyze this case, we're going to think of the monopolist decision as being split into two stages. First, the monopolist chooses a level of advertising, alpha, so this is the level of expenditure. And then in stage 2, given the choice of alpha, the monopolist chooses how much to produce. And we'll say there's excessive advertising if the monopoly firm would choose a higher level of advertising in stage 1 than would a welfare maximizer. So in the diagrams, we're going to be looking at a small increase in advertising expenditure. So let's consider an increase in advertising expenditure of E, where E is the difference between some initial level of advertising expenditure, alpha naught, and some new level of advertising expenditure, alpha 1. So this change in expenditure will shift the demand from D0 to D1. We will call D0 the pre-advertising demand curve, and we'll call D1 the post-advertising demand curve. Now, advertising is only profitable for the firm if it increases their equilibrium output, price, or both. And advertising can only increase welfare if it causes the equilibrium output to rise, assuming we use a fixed welfare standard. So we'll assume in the diagrams that the increase in advertising increases the equilibrium output and the price. So in this diagram, we have the pre-advertising equilibrium, we have the demand curve D0, the marginal revenue curve MR0, and the optimal price P0 and the optimal quantity Q0. Now let's consider the increase in advertising, which shifts the demand curve from D0 out to D1. And now let's find the new optimal choice of price and quantity. We need to draw the new marginal revenue curve and find the intersection of that new marginal revenue curve with the marginal cost curve. This gives us the new optimal point where the quantity is Q1 and the price is P1. So advertising shifts the demand curve out, increases the quantity, and increases the price. So how do we measure the change in welfare as a result of the change in advertising expenditure? Now, welfare is measured as the difference between consumption benefits and the costs. Here the costs consist of the production costs and the advertising costs, alpha. Now we have a problem here because we have this change in advertising which affects the demand curve because it affects consumers' preferences and therefore their willingness to pay. Now the question is that change in willingness to pay actually reflecting a change in the consumption benefits of consumers or not? Some argue that the consumers only think they're better off, so we should use the pre-advertising demand curve to measure the consumption benefits, while others argue that consumers are the best judges of their own tastes and so should use the post-advertising demand curve to measure the change in consumption benefits. So we have this question: which preferences should be used as a standard for measuring welfare changes? And to see why it matters, let's just remind ourselves of how we measure a change in welfare using a diagram. So here we have a demand diagram, and let's consider an increase in the quantity from Q0 to Q1. What is the effect on welfare? Well, to find the change in welfare, we just look at the area between the demand curve and the marginal cost curve from Q0 to Q1. So we're looking at this area here. So this is the change in welfare as a result of the increase in quantity. The area under the demand curve represents the change in consumption benefits, whereas the area under the marginal cost curve represents the change in production costs. And the difference between those two areas is the red area, the change in welfare. Now the issue is if the demand curve shifts, and that is what causes this change in quantity, then which demand curve do we use to measure the change in welfare? If the demand curve shifts out, then the area under the demand curve between the two quantities will be larger if we use the new demand curve than if we use the old demand curve. So if we use the new demand curve, we're going to get a larger measure of the change in consumption benefits, and therefore a larger measure of the change in welfare. So to get around this issue of whether to use the pre-advertising preferences or the post-advertising preferences, that is to use the pre-advertising demand curve or the post-advertising demand curve to measure the change in welfare, Dixit and Norman do both. They compare welfare using pre-advertising preferences as their standard. Then they do the comparison using post-advertising preferences, and they find that they actually get the same result in both cases. So if we're looking at a small change in expenditure, it doesn't actually matter whether we use the pre or the post-advertising preferences. So to see this, let's look at a diagram. So here I've blown up the earlier diagram, and we're going to look at the change in welfare using the pre-advertising and the post-advertising demand curves, and we're going to compare them. So let's start by looking at the change in welfare measured using the pre-advertising demand curve D0. So we're looking for the area under the pre-advertising demand curve, above the marginal cost curve, and between the two quantities. So the change in welfare is just area B minus the change in advertising expenditure E. What is the change in welfare using the post-advertising demand curve as the measure of consumption benefits? Well, now there's going to be an extra area, the area between those two demand curves, which is area C plus D. So the change in welfare using the post-advertising demand curve is B plus C plus D minus E. So the difference here is the area C plus D. Now let's think about a very small change in advertising expenditure. So E is very small. Then the movement in the demand curve from D0 to D1 is very small, and the change in quantity from Q0 to Q1 is very small. This would make areas C and D very, very small indeed. So area C plus D is a very small change in quantity times a very small shift in the demand curve. And so if we think of an infinitesimal change in advertising expenditure, we have the square of an infinitesimal here, which is 0. If we did everything with calculus, area C plus D is 0. So for small e, the change in welfare using the post-advertising demand curve is the same as the change in welfare using the pre-advertising demand curve. So let's now look at how the change in profits compares to the change in welfare. And here we're going to use the pre-advertising demand curve to measure the change in consumption benefits. We can do this because we've just learned that if the change in advertising expenditure is infinitesimal, we get the same measure of the change in welfare, whichever demand curve we use. So let's find the change in profits because of this small change in advertising expenditure. The change in profits is equal to A plus B plus C minus E, where A, B, and C are the areas identified in the diagram. Now, from earlier, we know that for a small change in advertising expenditure, area C is 0. Now let's compare this change in profit to the change in welfare. So the change in welfare is area B minus E, where we're using the pre-advertising demand curve. Now what is area A? Well, we can write area A as delta P, the change in the price as a result of the increase in advertising expenditure, times the initial quantity Q0. Now this area A, Q0 times delta P, is positive. So the change in profit is greater than the change in welfare. So the firm has a greater incentive to advertise than society. The increase in the firm's welfare, as measured by profit, is greater than the increase in overall welfare. Now, we can rearrange this equation to make the change in welfare the subject. The change in welfare, where I've dropped now the 0 because we're looking at an infinitesimal change, so it doesn't matter whether we're using the pre or the post advertising demand curve to measure the change in welfare, is equal to the change in profits minus Q0 times delta P. So the change in welfare is less than the change in profits. Now let's understand why these two areas are different. So what is this area A? The change in welfare is made up of two parts: the increase in the monopoly profits, less the increase in expenditure the consumers incur in buying the initial quantity at the higher price. So area A is a gain in profit for the firm, but it's a loss of consumer surplus because consumers are now paying more for the units from 0 up to Q0 as the price has gone up from P0 to P1. So this area here is a transfer from consumers to the firm. The consumers are paying more, so that's a loss to consumers, but that's cancelled out by the gain to the firm. The increase in expenditure by consumers is a gain in revenue for the firm. And this has no effect on welfare because the gains and losses cancel out. So in order to get the change in welfare from the change in profit, we have to subtract the change in profit that is just a transfer from the consumers to the firm. So now let's think about the monopoly's optimal choice of advertising. They will advertise up to the point where the marginal effect on profit is 0. So in this diagram, the optimal level of advertising for the firm is alpha star because that's where the slope of the profit function is 0. And so because at this point delta pi is 0, the change in welfare is just going to be this quantity here, where Q star is the monopoly's optimal quantity at the optimal level of advertising. And this quantity is negative. So the slope of the welfare function at the optimal choice of advertising for the firm is negative. So welfare here could be increased by reducing the level of advertising. So there is excessive advertising by the firm. To summarize, we've seen that when advertising is purely persuasive, a monopoly will advertise too much in equilibrium, and this is because the monopoly takes account of its increase in profits from those pre-advertising consumers paying more after advertising. This gain in profits is not a gain in welfare because it's just a transfer from consumers to the firm. And so because the change in profits is larger than the change in welfare, the firm has a higher incentive to advertise than would a regulator.